Now that we have our styling taken care of, we could turn our attention to how to create shortcodes. Shortcodes are going to let us display the same badges and tooltips. However, instead of just having them in widgetable areas, we could have them anywhere on a page or post, or even custom post types that use the content edit fields. To start, let's go ahead and take a look at the Shortcode API page on the WordPress Codex. The first thing we see here is what a shortcode looks like when it's added in the admin area in the content edit field. We could also see what a shortcode looks like when it accepts parameters. For example, this one accepts the parameter of ID as well as size. If we come down and look at the actual code, we could see a very simple example of a custom function that accepts attributes and then echoes something out. We then see the add shortcode for foobar, followed by the function that determines what should be displayed. We can come down and look at how this works when you have actual parameters to extract, and we could see again we have a custom function name with attributes, and then we extract all of the shortcode data, which gives us a variable for each parameter passed. So we could do something like return foo is equal to the actual variable of what they entered in as the parameter on the shortcode. The most important part here is where it says add shortcode and then the tag that we want to use for our shortcode. Everything else here is just custom functions working with a set of parameters. Let's go ahead, come into our main plugin file, and start creating our new shortcode. We'll add this code right above the Get Profile function and right below where we have our Register widget. We're going to call this function WP Treehouse Badges Shortcode. We then have some predetermined parameters that are used for all shortcodes, which are the attributes, followed by the content, which will set by default equal to null. Outside of that, we'll say add shortcode, and we'll set our shortcode to be WP Treehouse Badges, and then tell it to call this function that we're using to display the shortcode. A reminder here that this value right here is what somebody is going to type in inside of the content edit area to display this shortcode on the front end of their site. Now that we have the basic framework set up, there's some default code that we have to begin to add. The first is that we have to pull in the global post object to get information about the post in which the shortcode appears. The next step is to extract all of our parameters and convert them into variables that we could use. We'll do this using the extract function and then a special WordPress function called shortcode ats, which takes an array of the parameters we want, followed by the variable of ats. Inside of our array is where we'll place the parameters we're using as well as the default settings. The first is numbadges, which will set by default to be equal to 8. Next, we'll set the tooltip to display by default as on. Now that we have this done, we have access to numbadges and tooltip as variables. For this shortcode, we're going to give them the option of saying whether the tooltip should be on or off, and they'll type in on and off as the variable. While this makes it easier for the user, from a programmatic level, what we're really going to do is if it's on, we'll set the tooltip to 1, and if it's off, we'll set the tooltip equal to 0 or true and false. To do that, we'll say if tooltip is equal to on, then set tooltip equal to 1. We'll then copy and paste this and change it to tooltip off and tooltip 0. Next, we're going to rename tooltip to be display tooltip. This is the name of the variable we use in our front-end code, which is what we're also going to include here for what our shortcode will display on the front end of the site. All we have left to do now is pull in our profile feed. We could do this by copying and pasting code that we've used previously. Now that we have all of the variables and data we need to display our badges, we'll go ahead and write out a require statement to pull in our front-end template. However, when we're working with shortcodes and we want to use require statements, there's a little bit of extra code we need to use. The reason for this is that if we're using a shortcode and we use a require statement, it will output out that require statement at the very top of the post. What we need to do is wait till that shortcode is called in the content and then pull in our required file. In order to do this, we're going to use something called buffering. Buffering refers to a process where it's going to hold this information in sort of a temporary storage until we need to call on it. To do this, we'll use the function obstart, and then after our required statement, we'll say content is equal to getClean. As the final step, we're going to return the content. We could see a difference here between working with a widget and a shortcode in that we're going to be using buffering, and we're going to be returning an object at the very end, which is basically just our buffered required field. Now that we have this written out, let's go into our portfolio page and try adding in our WP Treehouse Badges shortcode to see if it works. I'll come onto the portfolio page, go to Edit It, and then right underneath where it has a link to Treehouse, I'll enter in my shortcode, WP Treehouse Badges. This is probably one of the most obvious areas where the namespacing is important, because if somebody else had called their shortcode Treehouse Badges, that would conflict with our shortcode. So, we'll update our post, come over and view our page, and we now see 8 badges displaying in place of our shortcode. Next, let's go back and see if we could update the number of badges that are displaying, as well as whether the tooltip displays based on the parameters that we set up. First, I'll change num badges equal to 4. Then, I'll set the tooltip equal to off. When we start documenting our plugin in the next page, we'll have to pay special attention to making sure that the user knows how to customize this shortcode using these particular parameters. We'll update this page, come back and look at our portfolio now, and we can see that we have 4 badges displaying with no tooltips. This is using the same code that we have for our widget over here, but we can see that we have different settings for that. For this particular site, what we'd ideally like to do is have 8 badges show up on our portfolio with tooltips, and then on the About Me and Home page, we'll display our recent widgets on the sidebar instead of on the main page. First, we'll come back and edit our page here, change the number to 8, and remove the tooltips off since we're having tooltips on by default. We'll update that, double check it, and now we need to customize what pages this widget appears on. To do that, we're going to add a new plugin called Display Widgets. We'll come in and click on Add New Plugins, and then search for a plugin called Display Widgets. Once we find it, We'll install it, activate it, and then come back in to our widgets page, open up our widget, and we could see that we now have these new options at the bottom where we could scroll through all of the different pages, categories, or templates and determine where we want it to show up. What this option is doing is saying that whatever checkboxes you check, it will hide it from that page. So we can come down, find our portfolio page, check that box and save it, and now when we come back to our site, we should see that on our portfolio page, that widget no longer appears. That's great. However, all of these other widgets aren't that appropriate for our site either. So we're going to remove them and have a standard little text box appear about contacting for work. We'll come into our widgets area, remove all of these widgets, and then add in a new text widget with a title of Work with Me, and then a short message saying contact me if you're interested in working on a project together. You can email me at mikethefrog@teamtreehouse.com. We'll have some paragraphs automatically added. And then since this is going to display on all the pages, we could go ahead and just click Save. When we come back and look at our site now, we could see that we have the Work With Me statement here and then our badges. And on our portfolio page, we have all of our badges as well as the Work With Me information. However, we don't have the duplicated badges here. This is great. At this point, we have all of the back-end coding done we need to have working widgets and shortcodes with our plugin. The next step of coding that we're going to do is add the ability to refresh our plugin feed whenever somebody visits the site.